Okay, picture this. What if something super common, like the salt you probably have in your kitchen right now, is actually seen in some traditions as holding a key
A key to what, though?
to inviting things like prosperity, uh, positive energy, maybe even landing that better job you've been after.
Hmm. It definitely sounds a bit mystical, doesn't it? But, it's fascinating how across different cultures and times, people have looked for ways to influence their world.
Right, using both like physical things around them and also deep spiritual beliefs.
Exactly. To attract success, money, well-being, whatever outcomes they desire.
And that's really relevant for anyone exploring manifestation or just trying to bring more positivity into their life. Yeah, understanding these different angles is super helpful.
Absolutely. So today we're going to dig into two really distinct ways people think about this. One involves using physical stuff, like that salt we mentioned, to affect your environment.
Okay.
And the other is rooted much more in faith, in a specific theological viewpoint about, well, divine favor and prosperity.
Got it. So our plan is to really unpack the main ideas here, look at the actual practices, what they're aiming for.
And also touch on some of the important discussions and, yeah, even criticisms surrounding them. We want to give you a clear picture, different ways of looking at this whole idea of attracting blessings and shaping your reality.
Perfect. Let's start with that first one then, the salt. It's pretty intriguing. Where does this idea come from?
Well, one place we see this is within Vastu Shastra. That's an ancient Indian system, all about harmonizing energy in buildings, in homes.
Okay, Vastu Shastra.
Right. And in that context, salt isn't just for flavor. It's seen as this really powerful tool for, like, energy management.
Energy management, how so?
The core idea is that salt has this inherent ability to absorb stagnant or negative energy from a space.
Huh. Like a sponge for bad vibes.
Kind of, yeah. By clearing out that unwanted energy, you're essentially purifying the environment. And that's believed to be key for allowing positive energy, including prosperity, to flow freely.
So it's like doing a spiritual cleanse on your house?
That's a good way to put it. And there are specific methods. A really important one is keeping the salt in open bowls.
Open, not covered.
Exactly. It needs to be uncovered so it can actively interact with the air and the energy around it, do its absorption thing.
Okay, makes sense. And does it matter where you put these bowls?
Oh, definitely. For attracting positive energy and prosperity specifically, the guidance is to place these open bowls in the north or northeast corners of your home.
North or northeast, got it. Those directions are considered important in Vastu.
Very significant, yeah. Especially for energy flow related to abundance and well-being.
Interesting. What about that type of salt? Does any table salt work or?
Generally, rock salt is recommended.
Yeah.
And Himalayan pink salt often gets a special mention.
Oh yeah, the pink stuff. Why that one?
It's seen as particularly pure,
Mm-hmm.
and having really strong energy cleansing properties.
Okay. And is this a set it and forget it kind of deal?
Not really. It's an active practice. The idea
Yeah.
is to replace the salt regularly, ideally about once a week.
Once a week. Wow.
Yeah, to make sure it stays effective at soaking up any negativity.
Mm.
You don't want it getting full, so to speak.
Right. And then what do you do with the old salt, the stuff that's supposedly absorbed all the bad energy?
You definitely want to get rid of it outside the home. Flushing it, maybe in running water if possible, is one way.
We're just in the trash.
Or in the trash, yeah. But make sure it gets taken away from your living area. The goal is to completely remove that absorbed negativity.
Okay. Any tips on the bowls themselves? Like material or color?
It's not always super strict, but often white or yellow bowls are considered auspicious choices. They're thought to kind of enhance the positive energy vibe.
White or yellow? Good to know. What about those salt lamps everyone seems to have? Do they fit into this Vastu thinking?
They do, yeah. They're seen positively too. They give off light, obviously, but also negative ions.
Right, I've heard about that.
And those negative ions are thought to contribute to a better energy balance in the room, aligning with that same goal of creating a favorable space.
Okay. Is there anywhere you shouldn't put salt according to this practice?
Yes, there's a specific caution about keeping it in bedrooms.
Really? Why is that?
The belief is that its strong energy absorption might actually stir things up too much, maybe lead to heightened emotions or even disturb your sleep.
Huh. Okay, that makes sense if you think about it powerfully shifting the energy.
Exactly. So that gives you a pretty practical look at how one tradition uses a physical thing, salt, to try to influence the environment for prosperity.
Okay, so now let's totally switch gears, moving away from physical objects and spaces.
Right, moving into a framework that's really rooted in faith and a specific kind of theology. This often goes by names like prosperity theology or the prosperity gospel.
Sometimes word faith movement, right?
Exactly, all related concepts.
So what's the absolute core belief here?
At its heart, it's a belief held by some within particularly charismatic Christianity that getting financial blessings and having good physical health aren't just, nice possibilities.
They're more than that.
Yeah, they're seen as always being God's will for believers, like a promised outcome that's available if you have the right faith.
Always God's will. Okay. And how do people believe they access that? Is it just waiting for it to happen?
Oh, definitely not passive. It's seen as being attained through very active faith. A key part of that is making positive scriptural confessions.
Positive confessions. What does that mean exactly?
It means basically speaking out loud, declaring desired outcomes that are based on promises found in the Bible.
Okay. And what else?
Generous financial giving is also really crucial, often talked about as tithing or sometimes seed faith, planting a seed of money expecting a harvest.
Right. So giving is linked to receiving.
Very directly, yes.
Yeah.
And in this view, actual material success, like wealth or possessions, is often seen as tangible proof, evidence of God's grace or favor on your life.
It sounds like there's a very specific way of reading the Bible behind this.
There is. The Bible is sometimes viewed almost like a divine contract, a covenant. Yeah, the idea being if believers hold up their end through faith, through giving, through confession, then God is, in a sense, obligated to fulfill his part, providing security and prosperity.
Interesting. What are some other key ideas or practices?
Well, there's a huge emphasis on personal empowerment. The belief that God wants people to be blessed, and because humans are made in God's image, they actually have a degree of authority,
Right.
sometimes called dominion,
Dominion. Over what?
over creation, essentially. And this ties right back into that positive confession idea.
How so?
By declaring God's promises with faith, believers think they can actively influence their circumstances. They're exercising that dominion over their own lives, their souls, even over material things.
So using words and faith to change things.
That's the core concept.
Mm-hmm.
Another really significant piece is how they interpret the atonement. What Jesus accomplished on the cross.
Okay.
In this theology, the atonement isn't just about forgiveness of sins. It's seen as also covering the relief of sickness and poverty.
Sickness and poverty are included.
Yes, they're often viewed as curses that were basically broken by Christ's sacrifice. So believers can claim healing and financial well-being through God's grace and their own faith, just like they claim forgiveness.
Wow. So health and wealth are seen as part of the redemption package, essentially.
Exactly, considered inherent rights for believers. And the path to getting that wealth often involves those specific spiritual principles we mentioned. Positive confession, visualizing the desired outcome.
And the giving part.
And definitely the giving, yeah. Giving money with an expectation of a multiplied return from God. Sometimes it's described in almost structured or formulaic terms, like you follow these spiritual laws, give X amount, confess Y promise, and you can expect Z result.
And I remember hearing connections made to the Old Testament.
Absolutely. Promises of material prosperity that were given to ancient Israel are often taken as applying directly to Christians today in the New Covenant. The idea is that faith and living righteously are the keys that unlock or release the promised prosperity now.
It's really fascinating to see how these theological points are put together.
Oh, yeah.
As we're unpacking all these different ideas. The SALT, the faith confessions, we genuinely love to hear what you're thinking so far, what's jumping out at you, maybe something resonates, or maybe something feels challenging. Let us know down in the comments.
Yeah, we'd love to hear your perspective.
And hey, while you're typing, if you're finding this deep dive useful, maybe take a quick second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It honestly helps us a lot in bringing more conversations like this to you.
Okay, so we've laid out the core ideas of prosperity theology. But it's really important to know that this framework, while super appealing to many people, has also drawn some significant criticism.
From who?
From various other Christian denominations, theologians, observers. It's been described using some pretty strong language, actually, like potentially irresponsible, promoting idolatry.
Idolatry, wow.
Yeah, or being contrary to core biblical teachings, and sometimes even being exploitative, especially of people who are poor or vulnerable.
Okay, exploitative, idolatry, those are serious critiques. What are the specific arguments critics make?
Well, a big one is the intense focus on material wealth itself. Critics worry that it elevates money to an unhealthy, almost idolatrous level.
How so?
They contrast it sharply with many of Jesus' own teachings. Passages about how hard it is for a rich person to enter God's kingdom, or his advice to store up treasures in heaven, not on earth.
So a direct clash with Jesus's warnings about wealth.
That's a major point critics raise. They also argue that this theology doesn't really have a good explanation for the poverty or suffering experienced by deeply faithful people throughout history.
Like the Apostle Paul.
Exactly, like Paul. His letters often talk about hardship, persecution, lack. Not exactly constant material ease and health.
So the criticism is that it maybe paints too rosy, too easy a picture of Christian life.
That's definitely part of it. Some label it poor theology, arguing it misunderstands fundamental concepts, like righteousness, suggesting you can somehow earn God's favor through your giving or your faith declarations, rather than it being a free gift received by grace.
Okay.
There's also concern that by putting so much emphasis on human needs and getting material gain, it can unintentionally push the central message of Christianity, salvation from sin, reconciliation with God through Jesus to the side.
Makes sense. What about those specific interpretations, like the covenant or the atonement being about wealth and health, too?
Those are definitely points of contention. Critics argue that focusing so heavily on material blessings and covenants, like the one with Abraham, misses the primary spiritual and redemptive point.
And the atonement covering poverty.
Similarly, interpreting the atonement to mean that poverty and sickness were automatically dealt with on the cross, just like sin, is strongly challenged by many theologians as reading more into the text than is actually there, according to mainstream views.
Right, and that give-to-get idea you mentioned.
Yeah, that principle, often called the law of compensation, give money to get more back from God, gets heavily criticized. Critics contrast it with biblical teachings that emphasize giving out of love, generosity, compassion, often without any expectation of earthly reward.
So a different motivation for giving.
Exactly. And even the nature of faith itself is debated. Is faith a force you use to tap into spiritual laws for personal benefit? Or is it about trusting submission to God's will, whatever the outcome might be? That's a core tension.
And you mentioned specific groups or people have spoken out.
Yes, leaders and groups from various backgrounds like the Nigerian Baptist Convention, figures like John Piper, even a Latter-day Saint apostle in related discussions have voiced these kinds of concerns pretty strongly. This ties into an interesting concept that sometimes comes up in these discussions, this idea of split-level Christianity. It highlights the potential danger of falling into what's called a magical mentality.
A magical mentality. What do you mean by that in this context?
It's basically the temptation to think that we as humans can somehow control or manipulate God or divine outcomes. Like, if we just perform the right formula, say the right words, do the right ritual, even make the right faith declaration, then God has to respond in the way we want.
Ah, okay. Like trying to use spiritual laws as techniques.
Exactly. It's a subtle shift from genuine faith and trusting submission to God's wisdom and will towards trying to control the results ourselves. And this pull towards formulas, whether it's with physical things like salt or specific spiritual declarations, can be really strong when people deeply desire certain outcomes, like prosperity.
So the real challenge is moving from trying to be in control to actually trusting God's larger plan.
Precisely. It pushes back against the idea that divine favor works like some impersonal law. We just need to figure out how to operate. The alternative perspective calls for being God-centered, not self-centered, focusing on submitting to Him and living His way, which, honestly, can be one of the toughest transformations for anyone.
That idea of our lives having an impact naturally leads to another way of thinking about this, right? That contrasting biblical metaphor, being salt and light, from Matthew chapter 5. How does that offer a different perspective than, say, focusing just on personal gain?
It really shifts the entire focus, doesn't it? Instead of being about getting blessings for yourself, the salt and light metaphor is all about the inherent nature and the outward effect that being a follower of Christ is meant to have on the world around you.
Okay, so believers are called salt of the earth and light of the world. Let's break that down. Salt of the earth.
Well, back then, salt was crucial, mainly for preservation, stopping food from decaying. It also added flavor, made things better.
Right.
So believers are seen as having this preserving influence in the world, pushing back against moral and spiritual decay, against corruption, and also adding flavor, bringing goodness, justice, God's love into their communities, making life richer.
Okay, a preserving and enhancing role. What about light of the world?
Light does a few things. It makes things visible, it guides, it exposes darkness. Jesus uses the image of a city on a hill. Everyone can see it.
Can't be hidden.
Exactly. So believers' lives, especially their good deeds and their obedience to Christ's teachings, should be visible. not hidden away. And this visibility naturally exposes the darkness or wrongdoing around them. And it also acts like a guide, pointing other people towards God.
So the impact comes from just living differently, openly.
Pretty much. And here's the crucial part: the motivation and the end result. The light shines, the good deeds are done, not so the believer gets praise or becomes wealthy.
But why then?
The explicitly stated reason is so that other people see these good works. And this is key: glorify your Father who is in heaven. The entire focus shifts away from personal gain and onto pointing others towards God.
Wow, that is a powerful contrast to focusing on attracting personal benefits.
It really is. And importantly, the ability to be this salt and light isn't presented as something you achieve through special formulas or seeking power for yourself. It's seen as the natural outflow, the result of living a life of humble obedience to Christ. Especially those attitudes he just described in the Beatitudes, like meekness, mercy, peacemaking.
And can that quality, that saltiness or light, be diminished?
Yes, the metaphor includes a warning. Salt can lose its flavor, become ineffective. Light can be hidden under a bowl.
How does that happen?
It's often interpreted as believers losing their distinctiveness, their positive influence. Maybe through compromising with worldly values, choosing comfort over following Christ's harder teachings, or failing to live with that wholehearted devotion. Even things like lack of peace and unity among believers can dim their collective light and make their salt less effective.
So maintaining that distinct character through faithfulness and integrity is really central to their impact.
Exactly. The influence comes not from seeking wealth or power for themselves, but from living a transformed life centered on God, which then naturally affects the world around them, ultimately for God's glory, not their own.
Okay, so we've really journeyed through some different landscapes today, haven't we? We explored that Vastu perspective, using something tangible like salt, with specific placements and practices, trying to harmonize the environment for positive energy and prosperity.
And then we shifted completely to prosperity theology, that faith-based system focusing on specific beliefs about God's will for health and wealth, access through faith, positive confession, giving.
And we also had to touch on the significant criticisms raised against that view from various theological standpoints.
Right. And finally, we contrasted both of those with that biblical metaphor being salt and light, where the impact isn't about personal gain, but about how a life lived in humble obedience to God naturally influences and points others towards Him.
Looking at these distinct approaches side by side, it really gives you, the listener interested in manifestation or attracting positive outcomes, a much richer, more nuanced view, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It shows the sheer variety of ways people have thought about and tried to engage with principles or powers they believe can shape their reality, whether that's through environmental energy, spiritual laws, or a personal relationship with the divine.
And it really underscores how important it is to look closely at the underlying beliefs, the motivations, and the potential complexities or controversies tied to each approach. So wrapping up our deep dive for today, we've covered the ground from the very physical, environmental approach with salt and Vastu to the specific theological framework of prosperity theology, focusing on faith and confession for wealth, and then that contrasting image of salt and light, emphasizing impact through obedience for God's glory.
Understanding these different philosophies and practices, it really does offer valuable food for thought for anyone exploring how to invite more success or well-being into their life. It also highlights the need to really examine the why behind the how.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe here's a final thought to chew on. Could it be that the most powerful way to attract blessings or success isn't just about mastering external formulas or expecting guaranteed outcomes?
What are you suggesting?
Maybe it's more about an internal transformation, a shift in your perspective, or even in your fundamental purpose. What does true prosperity even look like when viewed through these very different lenses we discussed? Which ideas, if any, really connect with you on a deeper level?
That's a great question to ponder. And we would genuinely love to hear your reflections on that or any takeaways you had from today's conversation. Please share them in the comments below.
Definitely do. And if you haven't already, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel. We've got more deep dives coming up, and we don't want you to miss out.